We begin with breaking news from Charlottesville, Virginia, where 2 people have been injured in an altercation with protesters who are out in force over the planned removal of a Confederate statue. Watch this.
Hi, and welcome to Take a Walk on the Right Side, a podcast dedicated to understanding the key ideas, books, organizations, and individuals that comprise an increasingly transnational far-right-wing movement. Take a Walk on the Right Side hosts open and nuanced discussion between myself, Jesse Morton, once a jihadist propagandist, and Matt Heimbach, himself once a white nationalist and far-right-wing ideologue. Matt was considered by many to be the future face of white supremacy in the United States, particularly after the disastrous 2017 Unite the Right rally he co-organized in Charlottesville. Since then, however, Matt has departed the movement and has transitioned toward new understandings and beginnings. We seek to assist by providing a deeper, first-hand look at the threat the extreme right poses. We do so each week by analyzing the impact of key propaganda pieces, the impact they've had on creating a constantly mutating ideology and worldview that drives far-right-wing movements currently. By including our personal experiences in between, we aim to document similarities across the myriad ideological strands of extremism. At the same time, we hope to encourage others not to be deluded by the extremist mindset of recruiters and to leave if they are actively involved. Without further ado. This podcast is typically about the key books and the key ideas that have driven the growth of far right-wing extremism. But in lieu of recent situations and recent happenings, this edition, we'll keep it focused on the overall scope of what we set out to do, which is essentially imparting a very nuanced and unique perspective. But we'll talk a little bit about the context that is formulating in front of us as we speak. Over the past few weeks, we have seen massive protests countrywide, at least ostensibly primarily around the killing of African-American George Floyd, killed in Minneapolis by police, and sparking a widespread resurrection of sort of Black Lives Matter protesters and turning into a massive movement that has sparked all kinds of different variables swirling around. A lot of confusion now, some good, some interesting things and developments on the ground that I think are very difficult for people to understand. And there's a lot going on right now, a lot of intermixing with the COVID situation, conditions of uncertainty, expected economic downturn, changing, altering things going on at the geopolitical level. So in so many ways, a lot of what was largely predicted to be a tumultuous 2020, no matter what the case, has been exacerbated, first at the beginning of the year with the killing of Qasem Soleimani and the impending thinking about a potential war with Iran, then transitioning into the awareness that we were entering into a re-election campaign, temporarily thinking that Bernie Sanders might be sort of a progressive, more socialist arm of the Democratic Party coming to power, but that being thwarted. And we see massive hyperpolarization on every scale. And so today, we have protests spreading around the country, ostensibly on platforms ranging from defund the police to simply ending systemic racism. And there's a lot of different movements swirling around. There's a lot of different interpretations of what's going on in front of us. And I guess, Matt, one of the things that we want to start with is dissecting a little bit about what we've achieved so far in this podcast. So far in this podcast, we've covered your own personal trajectory into and out of far right-wing extremism. We've talked a little bit about where you sit now, and then we allowed those personal experiences to transition into conversations around key works. We started with the Turner Diaries, and then we went into Siege, talked about the Siege Pill, and we talked about the intersection of what is widely looked at as a monolithic far-right movement. But in actuality, as you've dissected for us, there is serious dissimilarities and discrepancies between the label of white nationalist, the patriot militia movement, and then the white supremacists being different than white nationalists. And then in the far right, the birth of the far right and the sort of victory of the siege pilled or the Masonites or the Mansonites or, the far right wing jihadists. And so still, I think that there is a lot to talk about from that perspective, about the ways that what is going on in the country may seem like a sort of moment of civil rights and a moment of sort of triumphal victory. but perhaps you have a very different take on things, being that you were once an insider. And I think that right now there's this knee-jerk sort of tendency to think that we are on our way to not only reform, but to an ability to reclaim sort of democracy, with this idea that the Trump administration is an authoritarian regime that represents a threat to that, and that there's a great mobilization, particularly from amongst those on the far left, with a lot more impact of the ideology of the extreme far left, I guess you might say, becoming mainstreamed. And I think it will be very interesting to get Matt's take today. So we thank you for joining us. And I guess the first question for you this evening is, tell us what the hell is going on and how you're seeing things. Can you dissect some of this for us? And we'll just lead off into an open-ended conversation and discourse that can go anywhere you'd like. Take us on a journey.
Oh Lord, Jesse. Well, that's no small order you've put in front of me. It's great to be back. It's been a crazy few weeks. I know, just for us being able to find time to connect with all the work that we're doing and all the preparations we're making, all the planning, and just the whole normal life thing tends to get in the way. So it's great to be back in the podcast saddle for all of our dear listeners. But yeah, no, things are a little crazy right now. And there's several different narratives that, in my opinion, have been established that are just not particularly related, perhaps, to reality. And like, I saw a really great meme on Reddit, and it was a guy in a skull mask. Of course, we all know like the skull masks from talking about the siege pill and groups like Adam Waffen. And it was a guy relaxed on his couch wearing his skull mask, and it says, "White supremacists sit back and watch America tear itself to pieces." And in a lot of ways, I think that's pretty accurate. Like, we've got a real big problem here, where the FBI and all these authorities have come forward. People like Marco Rubio and like high-ranking members of the American federal government, like the people that are supposed to supposedly know what's going on, as the riots and the looting portion, which of course is different than protest, although riots can be a legitimate form of protest. I'm not going to dismiss that. But, I mean, stealing shoes, I don't really particularly care about the bottom line of stockholders for corporate America, so I'm not really going to make a judgment call. But when people are, like, stealing shoes, or stealing other stuff, whatever, and then you're watching the video, and you're watching the videos, and watching the videos, and some of the highest ranking people in the American government are saying that like white nationalists and white supremacists are secretly provoking like these riots and like participating in like organized looting and stuff. And then I go back and I kind of browse through the ecosystem of the far right, and everyone on Twitter and different platforms is like, everyone stay home and stay out of it, don't get involved, let the cops and the Antifa and everyone else handle it amongst themselves and fight it out. Everyone stay home. Not my circus, not my monkeys. Stop. Don't worry about it and stay home. And I mean, that seems to be a pretty pervasive thing, with the exception, something that we've talked about before, though. The influence of like the militia movement, and I think we're seeing that with like these Boogaloo boys, which is, kind of the Boogaloo is the idea of a civil war and conflict like that. There is some overlap maybe with some ideology tying to like the accelerationists in general, but I haven't really seen any depth, and I've tried to really stay up on it in terms of like an understanding of like James Mason or Charles Manson, or really the ideology. Some of the optics seems to be similar, but there have been arrests tied to that in terms of like wanting to perhaps attack protesters, but I don't see a very, very strong link between like organized political white nationalism and this Boogaloo element. I've seen people that have been arrested that definitely look non-white, which would be a little awkward for them to be white nationalists. Not that stuff like doesn't happen, but it seems more like this civic nationalist militia types, which I've long believed, in terms of looking at the right, are far more dangerous, because this idea that if you think you're losing America, then you have to fight back to keep it. If you're a white nationalist or a separatist, you've already lost America. It's all about having your own piece of dirt, not so much fighting to save the republic. And those are just two very different mindsets for how people view problems and how they would deal with them. So I think we've got some problems going on in this country. I mean, and we can go into a lot of different stuff here, but I feel like one of the biggest ones is that while there's a couple like militia guys in like Hawaiian shirts hanging out at protests, and there has been conflict, like there was that shooting where a militiaman was attacked by Antifa, and he shot back, and then he was charged like with like attempted murder or something crazy like that. But then the most serious charges were dropped, like once everyone got to like catch their breath and then look at the facts. And I feel like this happens a lot in America. And I don't know this militia guy from Adam. Who knows? He could be a crappy person. He could be a great person. I don't know. But the rush to judgment creates this media narrative and this feeding frenzy of it can go from, well, let's find out what happened. Let's do an investigation. Let's watch even the full 5-minute clip of a video to white supremacist neo-Nazis shooting random protesters holding a soup kitchen, like, you know, at a church, right? Like because the more extreme something becomes, it becomes clickbait. It's a more exciting story, and then people just feed on each other, and it really does a disservice, but it ramps up both sides, and then people get caught in the crossfire, metaphorically and literally, and lives can be destroyed. And, you know, our political class, I think, when it comes to prosecutors and judges, are so fundamentally biased based on public opinion. The law has long since stopped mattering. It's all about what the mob calls for. Same with the politicians, right? I mean, positions held for decades can disappear overnight if it's seen as politically convenient. So I think we're in this cyclone right now of everyone is really tense, everyone's really upset, and no one has any space for listening or evaluating. It's just like one tweet can send off something that goes all the way up to like sitting representatives, sitting senators, high-ranking members of the FBI and the intelligence community into saying things that just don't seem to have a whole lot of basis in fact, or seem to be a perversion of fact. And it's just everyone's wanting to just be on this outrage wagon. And it just seems like a freaking mess, Jesse. And like, I don't like where things are going with all this, to be honest, because the more it feeds on itself, the more people get themselves into like a mental war footing. People are already getting hurt. Property is being destroyed. You know, statues are being torn down. People are fighting amongst each other. Parts of America are seceding from other parts of America on a block by block basis, which, you know, is interesting in and of itself. But I think we're in a bad spot, man, and I don't think anyone's being the adult in the room, especially the people that are supposed to be the adults in the room. So I'm curious as to your thoughts, but I'm not too optimistic about where the way things are going here and the way the average American person is handling things.
Yeah, I thank you. I think that's a good introduction, and we'll just continue in that vein. There's so many different avenues that we can go down with regard to this, but it has been fundamentally fascinating. I mean, let's just take one point. Several weeks before we had the outbreak of protests, we had the sort of open up the economy protests that were associated with the conservatives. Coverage of that was very, I guess you could say, distinct than it is with regard to the recent wave of protests that are on the other side of the aisle. We were immediately told that white supremacists were infiltrating the conspiracy theorists, as they were called. We were told that he was shifting more white nationalists. And we were also told that they were breaking and violating all of the restrictions that would be necessary from permitting the spread of COVID. And they were widely portrayed as relatively ignorant, conspiracy theorists. Now, the same thing happens on the other side of the aisle. And people that are on the left and have been largely convinced that there is a massive white supremacist movement in this country and a massive push for authoritarianism in this country come out and they support something that I guess, you know, the average American doesn't have much awareness of what Black Lives Matter is, what they're calling for, what they believe in, or what Antifa, a group that has largely merged itself with Black Lives Matter, ultimately believes in. And there's just been this groundswell of sort of unconditional support because, of course, to end racism and to end structural racism or institutional racism is certainly a good thing. And I think it's safe to say there's very real, serious systemic and institutional racism in our country. However, I do think that there is a certain double standard. And I guess I'll kick it back to you by reading a little bit from Eric Hoffer, who I think is a fascinating individual, wrote a work of art that I think everyone should be reading. And this will allow us to sort of stay focused on our objective of looking at the ideas that are important with regard to extremism, particularly on the far right. And I think, I don't know if you've ever read it, but his book, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements, called basically The True Believer. And Hoffer writes something very interesting in his preface where he says, all mass movements generate in their adherents a readiness to die and a proclivity for a unified action, all of them, irrespective of the doctrine they preach and the program they project, breed fanaticism, enthusiasm, fervent hope, hatred, and intolerance. All of them are capable of releasing a powerful flow of activity in certain departments of life. All of them demand blind faith and single-hearted allegiance. All movements, however different in doctrine and aspiration, draw their early adherents from the same types of humanity. They all appeal to the same types of mind. And he sets the stage for that, and then he sort of describes arenas where it's sort of just fanaticism that is formulating. And looking at the root cause of such fanaticism, Hoffer later goes on to explain that he really thinks that the root of that proclivity to join a radical movement, even though all radical movements appeal to types of people with the same mind, he says there is in us a tendency to locate the shaping forces of our existence outside ourselves. Success and failure are unavoidably related in our minds with the state of things around us. Hence it is that people with a sense of fulfillment think it is a good world and would like to conserve it as it is, while the frustrated favor radical change. And I think it's safe to say that we're living in an era that is rampantly growing to a level of hyperpolarization that has the same risk indicators that precede civil war or civil conflict in what we used to call the developing world or a failed state, many of whom have been saying that the United States may be on its way to becoming a failed state soon. But I also think that if Hoffer's accurate in his assessment, then in fact what we have is the formulation of hyperpolarization that is breeding radicalization and mass movements on both sides of the political spectrum, probably equally in some sense intolerant and ignorant of what the other actually believes in, and quite willing to otherize the out-group to the degree where we have a justification of violence that's formulating. And so in that vein, are we witnessing a breakdown that could lead to civil conflict? And so what are, I guess in that sense, it's imperative to talk about Antifa and its impact, but what does that dynamic look like? And is there more we need to know in the same way that you differentiate white nationalists and white supremacists, or the militia patriot component of the far right versus the more, Masonite extremist subset? Is there more we need to know about Antifa? Is it a monolith? Is there a sort of impact from amongst that movement that you might think is negative or nefarious? It seemed in your first opening remarks that you felt as if a lot of the activity that has been put forth by whatever Antifa is, and maybe you could define that for us, what that represents in your mind.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good series of questions. I mean, well, as to your first point, I think America already is a failed state. We just have a higher production budget than countries we would typically think of. I mean, the fact that if you take polls, something like 80+% of Americans don't trust Congress and our other institutions. There's a fundamental lack of faith in the system on every level, and whether you want to look at unemployment as it currently stands, or mass incarceration, the persecution of the press, the corrupted elections, where a very few number of corporations have access to making voting machines that aren't accountable really to the people in any meaningful way, the influence of money in politics. If we were any other country, really, the United States would be wanting to invade it because it wasn't free. America's a failed state, and if we judged America by the standards that America puts on any other country, we would be probably the worst offender of human rights in the entire world. I don't think there's any recovery. I think the engines are dead and we're going to crash into the mountain. The question is what are the survivors? What are we going to eat? And what civilization in the mountains are we going to build together? Because I don't think a rescue is coming. But Yeah, like Antifa as institutions. I mean, well, and you brought up a point where you said they're not a single organization. That is true. They do have crews, though. So depending on the region, usually there are anti-fascist organizations from Rose City Antifa, Atlanta Antifa, and plenty more, which can be part of like the Torch Network, which is like a conglomeration. Like a council, essentially, of different anti-fascist crews. The Hoosier Anti-Racist Movement, lovingly their acronym is HARM, which have done harm to me previously. You know, anti-fascism has an interesting history. Originally, anti-fascism was founded by the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany. And what the interesting thing about the KPD was they were true communists. They were supporters of the Soviet Union, and very often the symbols we'll see here in the United States and in Western Europe for anti-fascism, one is the logo of the Red Front, which is the paramilitary branch of the KPD, and it's the two flags. And then the other one is the three downward arrows, which was the logo used by the Iron Front, right? And this organization was founded essentially to support the Social Democrats, and they believed in fighting the National Socialists, they believed in fighting the Conservatives, and they believed in fighting the so-called named anti-fascist action of the KPD. So American Antifa actually like blurs symbols together between social democracy being supporters of the Soviet Union, Stalinists essentially, and a whole bunch of other issues like from Weimar Germany, which don't really make a whole lot of coherent sense. There's a lot of anarchists that are involved, and anarchists have come a long way from like Peter Kropotkin and the anarchists of old. They're distinct and rather destructive. Instead of like building communes and being self-sufficient and stuff like that, they seem far more likely to like throw a brick at someone. And of course, when you think about the ideology, the idea of like being a Stalinist or at least a supporter of like the Soviet system, compared to an anarchist, which of course the ideological underpinnings of Stalinism would be a socialism in one country, which then you can export. You must have the state to be able to defeat capitalism and imperialism to liberate the workers. We've got to do these things. We've got to organize, which is the opposite of anarchy. But I mean, in America, in my experience, like they don't really come to a whole lot of coherent ideology sometimes when it comes to alliances. I mean, same with the far right, same with white nationalism. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of infighting, and I mean, in the United States, we see the rise of anti-fascism, especially organization-wise, with Trotskyists and those that were really kind of turned their back ideologically throughout the Cold War on the Soviet Union and Maoist China, and the actual successful socialist revolutions, in comparison to support of like this Trotskyist sort of perspective that really gets away from class war and a lot of things. I guess my biggest critique would be, Marx said, workers of the world unite, and Marxism is fundamentally about the unification of the working class and taking the means of production for the workers. And it's not about like dudes wearing dresses and getting to use a woman's bathroom. Like, it's not about abortion. It's not about any of these like bizarre social issues that people want to bicker over about, like the need to like force like a vegan diet on every person or whatever, right? Like all these social things that have nothing to do with economics and the working class owning the means of production have really dominated the thought, whether it's the Frankfurt School, which were leftist intellectuals who came to the United States after the rise of Hitler and went to Columbia and other universities, who set up for the 1960s radical movements, to the legacy of Antifa over the past 50 years. I mean, they're allowed to commit acts of violence, especially against political opponents they disagree with, around the country and get away with it. They're allowed to attack police and get away with it. They're allowed to destroy property and businesses. I'm going to separate that entirely from my thoughts on communities of color rising up in protest right now. Anti-fascists are overwhelmingly white, not a lot of members of color traditionally, and based on studies that have been done in Europe and things like that, they're usually well educated in terms of degrees, not necessarily sense. usually coming from, middle class, upper, rich backgrounds, while there are working class members. And, not to paint all Antifa with a broad brush, I've met some nice individuals that have had a good impact on me. Most of them are now more involved in community organizing than anti-fascism and black bloc. Yeah, like anti-fascism, I think, is just like a destructive temper tantrum in many ways of kind of the bourgeois elements of society that want to, just kind of wantonly destroy things.
I think it is a conversation that is certainly marked this evening by complexity, but I do think that the very pertinent point that you made is that it's not about color, it's about class. And this is something that goes far back into the American historical tradition. I guess you might say that the slave trade started in the early 1600s. And the problem fundamentally was that you had indentured servants and you had African slaves. And for about the first 50 years of that experiment, so-called Negroes and white servants in the 1600s, in the first half of the 17th century, essentially, were largely unconcerned about any physical differences because they empathized with each other because their conditions were relatively the same. And the real problem that formulated for, the very elitist sort of subset, the plantation owners and the British elite primarily, was that the indentured servants that were coming were free mixing with black slaves, and that they sort of started to see little bursts of potential, radicalization, if you will, or rebellion and revolution. And so around 1660s, 1680s, they started to pass laws all over the South in particular, mostly that in the event that any English indentured servant was caught fraternizing or having sexual relations or intermarrying with any Negro, mulatto, or Indian, that they could be criminally charged, and that they would lose their indentured servant status, and that they would essentially enter into the realm of themselves being a lifelong slave. What that produced as time went on was the separation of working class whites and blacks. And then you have this long historical trajectory of the phenomenon of, class-based relations and the capitalist system, and Civil War ends, and you essentially use the 13th Amendment and the clause that says unless an African American is criminally charged, then they are free. And so you go through the formulation in the early stages of creating the prison industrial complex. But a lot of this stuff that is in the historical past is simply, I think, being replicated right now in front of our very eyes. I think that the interesting thing is that working class whites are looking at this, and they've been grieving for many years, as you know very well, of this sort of great replacement sort of theory that essentially white people are under assault through multiculturalism and through other variables, loss of jobs, globalization overseas. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you also have the very serious distinction between the life of a millennial who's born into an affluent household and vis-a-vis a father, as you said, with father issues on that side, who basically was successful largely because they themselves were born into affluence in a period where all you had to do was go to college to get a job in finance or as a VP or in the realm of management or whatever due to your networks of privilege and contacts. But that didn't necessarily end up becoming the case with macroeconomic circumstances, as you point to. Coming out largely, I think we have to start this trajectory at 9/11. And so I think you make a good point that there's very little awareness even of the macro. And this is just another embodiment, although grievances may be very real. And there is a lot of talk, we have to admit, about the prison industrial complex. And there's a lot of movement inside of these protests to do things like tear down the system. But again, back to the civil rights activists observing this in their age-old wisdom and thinking back to their era and saying there's no leader here, there's no vision, there's no plan. I think we should be very weary because it's almost as if we've entered into a cumulative countrywide state of post-traumatic stress disorder, and no one is willing to stand up and say, at the end of the day, it hasn't really been about conservative or Democratic Party. And Donald Trump is not really so much a polarizing force that appeared out of nowhere, but largely something that was facilitated by the onset of polarization and rampant wealth inequality that came about with the way that we responded from 9/11 up to the point where we almost bankrupted ourselves due to the war on terror and the subprime mortgage crisis, low interest rates to keep Americans spending so that they didn't get depressed while they were waging a war against a couple hundred al-Qaeda supporters in the Afghanistan mountains and caves, as we were told back then. And largely, to bring it back to macroeconomics, I mean, this is basically the objective that was set forth by Osama bin Laden. We talk about this a lot on September the 11th. It's a war of attrition. And I think in his grave, he might be looking on and saying, wow, like we now have the domestic conflict that will allow them to implode from within, while they all seem to neglect the fact that post-COVID, we are likely going to be going through another recession that is probably going to be more impactful and induce more long-term employment than the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008. And if they might be wise enough to look backwards, they will realize that when we were under those conditions and the transition came from George Bush into Barack Obama, the first African-American, sort of president, and he was supposed to unify us all again and, do something similar to what this leaderless movement is supposed to do for us now. The problem was he didn't care anything at all about poor working class people, and instead his solution to solve what was then an onsetting depression, and a lot of people were talking about the end of the capitalist American system altogether, was to bail out Wall Street and to do what any traditional politician has done since largely, I guess you could say, Bill Clinton and the onset of rampant globalization with NAFTA and the things that sort of gutted working class America's manufacturing capacity. And so you're right. I mean, conversations like this about the trajectory of macroeconomics and the system that we live in, the understanding of the impact of neoliberalism in creating rampant inequality, and the fact that the frustrated that Hoffer points to and he talks about is driving the movement. People are frustrated with the movement. They don't care about the system itself. I guess from that statement and thinking about the underlying causality, the macro, and how it's influencing the micro, but how the micro is really just only has the capacity, because it's really based in this cancel culture. It's like forced values, and if you don't agree with us, you're not a liberal. But in a sense, they don't even understand the authoritarianism of the way that they're approaching the problem. They don't understand that for every action, there's an equal or opposite reaction. And that essentially, while they're canceling everyone that they possibly can who says all lives matter on Facebook and is getting fired for it, what they're doing is they're cementing the grievance of the people that, if they really cared about a just world and creating systems for working class peoples to have access to good things like healthcare and decent paying jobs, they're actually doing the same thing that we might say the plantation masters did in the early 1600s when they realized that indentured servants and African American slaves were living together in not harmony, but sharing their situation and their circumstances, and they knew that that could be a massive problem for them going forward, and so they started to segregate. And you have white America and black America ever since then, and then you have the adulteration of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so while we make a great deal about making Juneteenth a national holiday, we don't have a lot of conversation that is bringing us into contact with the actual historical trajectory of our society. And there's very little awareness that, unfortunately, while we want white people to take blame and accountability for all of the racism that their forefathers did, we'd be hard-pressed after recent policy decisions. Not to say that structural racism and systemic racism doesn't exist, but we'd be hard-pressed to not take a moment and look at the conditions of white working-class America as well, and realize that there's very real conditions of high unemployment. There's very real conditions of neglect. There's the humiliation of the service economy, the lack of manufacturing capacity. There's the opiate epidemic. There's all sorts of variables that these people are living through every day. And I could see, because I come from one of those communities, full well why, while the rest of affluent sort of leftist America gravitates towards this thing as if it's built on, basic principles of justice and civil rights, but doesn't necessarily recognize that for those poor working class white people, they feel like essentially there's no one left to listen to their concerns or to even care about them, because we've created this groundswell of belief that there's white supremacists in every single corner on every single main street in the United States, and that fundamentally white working class people are the problem. And I do agree that that means there's no chance in hell that anything productive might be able to come about from this until we are able to build bridges that eradicate those divides. And I also agree that the best way to eradicate those racial divides is to have people identify the underlying macroeconomic causality of it all, and to get people of different colors, of different races, of different ethnicities, not, I don't think, to overthrow the system in my personal opinion, but I do think that reform is much needed. And I think that we need to return to principles that are embodied in our Constitution, and I believe in the Declaration of Independence, and that birthed an ability of Abraham Lincoln to say, yes, you're right, the country was imperfect at its founding, but it was based on ideas, and it was based upon the idea that it could evolve. And therefore, while the Constitution itself may have not given equal rights to blacks and to African Americans and to Indians, it did in fact create pathways for that to evolve into the future, largely in the cause of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the belief that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And so I really think that the vision is lacking. I agree with you that the macroeconomic sort of perspective of, okay, that's great, but how are we going to get back to the root cause of this all, which I think the case can be made is largely an economic one. And you'd think for people that are anarchists or for people that are on the far left, it would certainly have to be. I mean, that is what essentially the root grievance of capitalism and the sort of cultural, social, psychological consequences of that system on the human ontology and epistemology bears. So I just wonder from there, and knowing that I myself have now sort of gone off and we're in a very general realm of thinking and sort of just kicking out a bunch of ideas, like, what do we do? I mean, what is the alternative? How do you craft something that says, I mean, basically, if you stand up and you say these principles are really going to be divisive, they're not exactly unifying, and over the long term, they may be only contributing to the further exacerbation of very different experiences on the right and the left, or however you want to put it, hyperpolarizing sort of culturally, socially, and politically. We still haven't gotten to the election, the presidential election in November, which is certainly, absent COVID, absent these protests, absent everything that's happened so far in 2020, already was going to, further divide us. So how do we get out of it? Like, what is the way that, in your opinion, we should be addressing the issue?
Well, Jesse, I think you brought up so many good points. I mean, for me, this is the moment where we really do need to come together. And I know that sounds really cheesy, right? But when it comes to realizing, as you pointed out, what white working class communities are facing, it really goes across all normal, everyday Americans, and really around the world. But let's just talk about in this country, like the struggles of most people, regardless of color or creed, they're being grounded in the dirt. They're suffering. Their families are in need. They have unstable economic situations, and their child's livelihood is probably going to be worse off. And that's just if things continue on as they are, instead of having some sort of catastrophic failure, which increasingly looks likely. I was just reading something this morning about Deutsche Bank predicting the increasing percentages of catastrophic global economic failures here in the next decade or 2 decades, and the numbers are going up and up. So I think if we were able to realize that these structures, right, of which I agree race plays into it, but it is overwhelmingly class-based, in which race is used as a bait and switch in a lot of different ways. If we could unite on those class lines and find that solidarity, we could drop issues that really fundamentally don't matter, I think. Like, for, let's say coming from, I wouldn't call myself a conservative, but the more socially conservative views, like, my personal views on, say, like abortion, right? Okay, and then on the other side, we've got people who very strongly have feelings about Confederate statues or whatever, right? Like atheists that don't like Christianity whatsoever, or people on the other side that don't think gay marriage is legitimate, whatever. And other people that think gay marriage is great and they want to see as much gay marriage as possible. Okay, whatever. So we've got all these different social views, different religious views, and things like that. But the structure, the shackles that unites all of us in bondage can only be broken by all of us together. And I really think that focusing on a class-based shared interest that goes also for issues of the environment, because we can't really have a planet, right? The super rich, the wealthy, the powerful, they have bunkers, right? They're developing private spaceships at this point, like doing all sorts of crazy stuff. We are in this together, and if we can find these community grounds, or common ground, and I think not focus so much on the divisive social issues, of which anyone can find anything to argue with people, things they might disagree with about, between different religious views, social views, things like that, cultural views. Compare someone in Guatemala to someone in a province in China, compare that to someone who lives in Dubai, whatever. We're going to find some friction, right, due to different cultures, identities, traditions, things like that. And that's okay. It's not bad that things are different, but we should find our common ground. And I think in this system, whether it's dealing with issues of the police, whether it's dealing with issues of the economy, having politicians that are unaccountable to the average everyday citizen, the lack of access to health care, mental health care, infrastructure, things like that. These are our grounds of solidarity that we can understand one another and begin to change the system for the better. And it doesn't have to be violent, right? Like it doesn't, because if we can base on understanding and compassion and love for your fellow man and find that common ground, instead of trying to bulldoze people that you disagree with on social issues that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things, in my opinion, in comparison. I mean, that's like arguing like what you're going to have for dinner in the ballroom of the Titanic after it's already hit the iceberg, right? Like, if you don't get off the ship in the first place, if you don't handle the primary problem, it doesn't really matter if one side wants to go have roast duck and the other one wants to have fish, right? Like, you're all going to die. And we're when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to the social pressures, we're in a pretty bad spot. Like, Titanic hitting the iceberg tier. And I really think we should stop bickering over things that really don't matter, or are just symbols of being mad or upset, and come up with concrete goals so we can get concessions from the system to make a better world for ourselves, our children, our neighbors. Like, that's the way to do it, instead of the people that had bought them off. And like, that's the model I think that can bring things about. I think we can make a lot of positive, peaceful changes with communities working together, and promoting understanding across color and cultural lines. Like, it's not going to come from like anti-fascists throwing Molotov cocktails. It's not going to come from destroying statues. It's not going to come on the flip side of like white guys putting on militia gear and wanting to wave guns at Black Lives Matter protesters. Like, it creates this continual system that just keeps rolling back and forth. And if we can find our common ground, to quote one of my favorite songs by Body Count, the band, but their song "No Lives Matter" that came out a couple of years ago, what they said is, but honestly, it ain't just black, it's yellow, it's brown, it's red, it's anyone who ain't got cash, poor whites that they call trash, right? And like, that's the system. All of us are in it together, and I think this is the moment. If we can avoid falling into just like racial conflict or the left-right divide, the status quo will continue until we can come together and make a difference. So that's what I hope we can do. We can put aside racial hatred, animosity, find common ground, and start changing things.
So let me go into a little bit about what people might hear when they hear you say that. A lot of times since you've released your recantation or your changing views through Light Upon Light, actually. The critique on you has been that for a long time you were always about working across racial lines, but that in a sense what you've been portrayed as with regard to coverage of your departure from the far right is someone who is merely gaming the system, manipulating, trying to get out of trouble for Charlottesville, but essentially holding the same views that you held while a alleged white supremacist. And so essentially they say Matt Heimbach hasn't changed at all. He's still holding the same positions that he always held. But yet you talk of compassion and love and dialogue and engagement and looking at the reality that the well-being of working class whites is intertwined with the well-being of African Americans, not to denounce the actuality of systemic racism. But what is your difference now, juxtaposed against what you were calling to, for example, when towards the end of your career you sort of had an interaction with the National Socialist movement and tried to bring about this similar sort of alteration in their, some would say PR, others would say with regard to their perspective of cross-collaboration with other ethnic groups that were based on nationalist concepts. And so those accusations that I'm sure that you come into contact with frequently on social media, particularly from amongst Antifa and its more extremist factions, I think you might say, what would be your response to that in lieu of saying the things along the lines of what you just said and having your critics hear, well, this is nothing new. I mean, Heimbach's always basically espoused this. What's the difference between you then and now? How do we address the criticisms of those that say this is nothing new? Matt Heimbach is still a white nationalist.
Well, that's actually a great question. And I mean, first of all, this is kind of one of the disconnects that I think has existed for my entire engagement in politics. Because on one hand, you got a point, Matthew Heimbach was promoting not hating people of color and trying to find ways to work with them throughout his entire nationalist career. They admit that in one breath, and then the next breath they're like, that means he's still an evil white supremacist that hates people of color, right? It's a Orwellian doublethink sort of exercise, right? And in a lot of ways, there's really kind of a hatred that is promoted against whites in general, and it's for things like slavery. It's for things like structural inequality. And then, I look back and say, well, hey, I wasn't involved in that. My ancestors weren't involved in that. And then it kind of made me think that so I don't want people to blame the ethnic group community that I come from for the sins fundamentally of the few, right? And paint it in a broad brush, because the problem is not your white farmer from Iowa or the white Waffle House waitress from Georgia or whatever. It's the people with power, economic, social, political power, and capital that are the ones doing and creating the structures of oppression, okay? And I shouldn't treat other groups like that. I should look more and realize that this is a system broken down by those with power and those without. And the vast majority of people of all ethnic backgrounds don't have power. We've all been kept out of the system. So for me, I mean, that was one of my biggest shifts, is viewing things more, again, class-based, and removing myself from so much of wanting to create a white nation, but realizing these systems bind all of us together and are strangling all of us, some a little faster than others, but all of humanity is tied in this together. The destruction of the planet is a big part of this too. And to promote just, I'm going to save this patch of dirt and this group of people, actually wouldn't dismantle or destroy any of these systems. It wouldn't actually fix any of the problems. War and environmental destruction and capitalism and things like that would still exist. And eventually, whatever Garden of Eden I politically would be able to carve out with me and my comrades or whatever, would eventually be would fall victim as well, right? Because these systems still existed. As long as there was oppression, right, we need to be in solidarity with people anywhere in the world. And that's because the revolution to make the lives of the people better can't survive oppression anywhere. So liberation is not a zero-sum game, but it has to be done completely. Like it's got to be won everywhere for anyone to be free, which is different than when I just viewed things as being about my community and identifying my community as just white people, and trying to create a geopolitical solution for the problems of globalism and capitalism and environmental destruction on a very, very kind of micro level in the grand scheme of things, where instead I now want to view things on a macro level and redefine my community based on I've got more in common with a person of color that comes from the same region and has the same everyday life as me, and than I do with Mitt Romney, even though Mitt Romney is white AF, right? Like that's a big difference. Is also redefining my community. So I think my politics have shifted, but I do believe that the differences and distinctions, especially reevaluating my communities and viewing things more through an international lens, and a lens that brings together of why people of color struggle here, isn't just something I can ignore. It's not something that doesn't affect me. It affects all of us because everything is tied in together. I do think there's a large substantive difference ideologically that practically applies itself in every regard of how I view the world, if that makes sense.
I mean, it does, but we're living in an era where people cannot necessarily understand nuance and the fact that small distinctions sometimes have major implications. For me, it's an indicator of our unwillingness to forgive and our unwillingness to understand. I do believe that you are correct to ascertain that the only real way out of this is to look at the fact that we are inextricably linked when it comes cross racial lines at a class basis at this point. The discrepancies and the inequalities in wealth distribution in this country, particularly since the onset of the war on terror, have grown at a level that we talk about, but we don't really recognize the actual ramifications of that. We don't really recognize the fact that the problem is that conditions for both classes of working class people are essentially deteriorating to the point where the quality of life and the discrepancy in the quality of life between the elites and the working class. And in a sense, we do see, with regard to wages, with regard to healthcare, with regard to the prison industrial complex, with regard to the way that we have, squandered hundreds of billions of dollars with regard to development abroad while neglecting any sort of infrastructural development domestically, with regard to all sorts of really fundamental problems that have formulated over the past 20 years. I really don't hear a lot of talk about that and an awareness about that. And for a working class white individual who already feels like the quality of their life is deteriorated and they're living in working class American towns where their forefathers had access to manufacturing jobs and may have very well experienced a great degree of privilege, they look at themselves and this question of white privilege doesn't make any sense because they haven't experienced it at all. They've grown up post-globalization. And so millennial white working class America is very different than millennial affluent white America, and is very different than millennial African American America. And so again, the problem is really you're dealing with a symptom and a root cause. And the root cause is a society that is corrupt at its root. And there's no way that the branch of a tree, if the core roots of the tree are corrupt, then the branches will be corrupt as well. And so if you address a corrupt branch of a corrupt root without addressing the root, oftentimes what you get in actuality is you actually might mean well, but in the end you do more harm than good because you don't understand the complexity of relating the micro to the macro and then being able to act upon the meso or whatever, however you want to put it. And I just don't see a degree of consciousness that seems to me to have a productive energy or a productive spirit to it. The simple fact of the matter is that if you even disagree or want more clarification or to add nuance to any of the principles that are currently being espoused, you might be, fired from your job or you'll certainly be canceled. I myself, for engaging in discourse with people accused of being a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist, and so the eras of cancel culture and the culture wars and identitarian politics are really at a degree where the primary concentration is indeed, as you suggested earlier, on addressing the symptoms of a root disease without any awareness of how the symptom is actually a consequence of the widespread corruption and the spoiling of the root order that we've lived in. Call it whatever you want. I think it really started to fragment with the onset of the war on terror, and it's probably because of selective bias, being a jihadist for so long and knowing that we were told and encouraged adamantly to create polarization inside of the democratic West by going at the conservatives first, creating a groundswell of Islamophobia, and then using that to brandish the American Muslim community as if it was under attack, and as if it was one step away from being annihilated, like the Jews in the Holocaust, et cetera, and sort of thinking about how we might allow the democracies that were essentially, we were told at the end of the Cold War, where liberal democracy was just destined to become blanketing the entire world. What the jihadists, I think, showed us on September the 11th was that they revealed the underlying hypocrisies of that system and the root system, but fundamentally fascinating how all of what was mobilized to wage a war on terror abroad has now, in a sense, been brought home. So the same radicalization models, the same counterterrorism policies that we used to wage the jihadists, the same military equipment that went to Iraq that now rests in the hands of local police forces because there's not very much else to do with it. This same sort of process of discriminating against people and declaring a great, widespread awareness and overblown threat. I mean, granted, there's a lot of white supremacy in our country. There's a lot of extreme far right-wing activity, but you would think that it is much more prevalent than it actually is, were you to pay attention to the echo chamber of the traditional liberal or the left in general. And so I can only imagine how all of this fits into, and to get back to ideology maybe, the sort of thinking in white nationalist and white supremacist movements that, liberal elites were in conjunction with this sort of grand Jewish conspiracy to replace white working class America. And when you can look at the polling, I mean, Reuters ran a short piece earlier today. I believe it was based on a Pew poll, or no, it was an Associated Press poll. And it showed that overall Americans support the protests, right? But in actuality, when you peel back that support, 80% of African Americans support the protest. Only 50% of whites do. And so that means amongst white populations, the left is certainly more prone to support the protest. But all of these conservative Americans who, as you say, typically hold very different cultural values are essentially feeling themselves as if they're under further assault. But I would argue that underneath it all, I think the adulteration of this from amongst liberal elites is largely to sort of mobilize their anti-Trump sentiment in their own belief that you get rid of Donald Trump and then you can get your country back. But certainly not someone who's going to go away simply by losing an election in November. And certainly not someone who's going to find his followers and his supporters going away, losing an election in November, particularly with the very real possibility that he declares the elections a fraud and sets up the conditions for further exacerbation of the hyperpolarization that we see witnessing. Sort of parallel social media networks are formulating now. People are migrating more and more increasingly to outlets like Gab, where we know there's this idea of the preservation of free speech, but they are in fact, it is in fact a platform that is an incubator for far right-wing recruitment, I guess you might say. And there's still an overwhelming concentration on portraying the fact that the riots that are invested and that are identified inside of these protests are actually initiated and instigated by far right-wing supremacists. And there's cases of that. And there's a lot of really crazy, fascinating and appalling things going on, like the hanging of two men in California, the killing of one of their brothers. First they declared it a suicide. Now there's a pending investigation. There is probably a lot of effort on factions of the far right to sort of manipulate these protests and to sit back and to watch them cave into their narrative. I really think that at the end of the day, the problem is that there's really just no ability to see that for every action there is an equal or an opposite reaction, and that the idea that you're simply going to be able to annihilate those that may have run along with sort of this Trump campaign, this idea that all of the Trumpers will simply go away, and that largely as a result of these protests, essentially it's an indicator that we're taking our country back. The problem is, I really just don't see how it's not going to exacerbate the divides. And that's why I think perspectives like your own are very important, where, you know, despite the fact that you're blamed for once holding the same view, you have come to realize that essentially the ethnic divide is actually part of the problem. Again, back to the very real question, is there a chance for what's unfolding before us right now to turn into something productive?
Yeah, I mean, like, the big problem is how loud I think the Antifa contingent is, basically. And they're really loud on Twitter. They're really loud at galvanizing these mobs and these, you know, media outlets, which is its own environment, right? The progressive media, where they've got all their little blogs and websites and stuff like that, and they all amplify and signal boost each other. But I think, you know, based on looking at polls, for instance, of you know, like white conservatives and things like that, amongst the working class, like, huge numbers support, over a majority, increasingly now are supporting things like universal health care, are supporting things like investment infrastructure and things like that. And I think, like, a modern Huey Long, the former governor of Louisiana, probably one of the greatest Americans, in my personal opinion, that's ever lived, he helped the poor. And back during segregation, like, let's remember this, like, he was governor during the Great Depression in Louisiana. And segregation was very much alive and would be for decades more in the South. And he actually went to war with the Klan, essentially, and said that that black folks have every right to dignity, they have every right to work, they have every right to have a chicken in the pot, and they have every right to be treated as a citizen of the state, while also then helping poor whites and across the board investing in huge amounts of public works and universities, hospitals, roads, bridges, you name it. He was doing it to actually help his people, not just one section of the people, but all the people. And when he was assassinated, that hundreds of thousands of people, white people, black people, old, young, came to go to his funeral, to view the body. And there really is that spirit of unity, right? Like, you don't have to be involved in the cancel culture and the radical stuff. And I think looking at polls of Hispanic Americans, black Americans, of old Americans, young Americans, I think most people really fundamentally can agree with the government investing in the people across the board and making our lives better by, you know, doing things to improve the local environment, with things like we had during the Great Depression with the New Deal, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, being able to, I mean, if we just spent $2 trillion fixing the locks and dams and roads and bridges and all these things, we could create a huge amount of wealth generationally, right? Because for every dollar of infrastructure that you spend, you end up recouping far more in that for the national economy. But helping people get out of the slump. I mean, the COVID slump hasn't even started yet. Like, once in July, the extra $600 a month, or $600 a week, pardon me, going to boost unemployment benefits, once that ends, I think we're going to have huge economic problems. It's just like in Britain, I was reading the other day that millions of people still have their jobs because the government is basically paying employers to keep people on the rolls. But as soon as that ends, over half of them said that they're going to have to start laying people off. Like, the COVID economic crisis hasn't even begun yet, and people think that we're starting to weather it. I mean, the bond market alone is going to destroy the American economy and destroy retirement as we know it. And states and localities won't be able to pay their basic bills. It's going to be a bad time. We are just entering this. So for me, I think we need to ignore the very loud voices on the left and the right, right? And basically the politicians, just turn them off. Forget that they really exist in the media, because the majority of people, I think, across color and creed and age, and all these things that divide us, I think most people really can agree on improvements we'd like to see in our system, to make our country better, to make our lives better, and to make it more fair, and to make it more just. I don't think you're going to get a James Mason worshiping Atomwaffen member to agree with a public work project to get, Muslim Americans, Catholic Americans, Jewish Americans, white Americans, black Americans, so on and so forth, learning how to fix a bridge or weld and doing it together. On the flip side, I don't think you're going to find a radical leftist who's going to agree with any sort of social programs going to help poor, impoverished, and working class white Americans as equals. Not in a superior way, but as equals with other groups of people. I don't think you're really going to find that either. So let's forget these super loud voices, which is so hard because some dude with a tweet or a girl with a tweet that has a lot of opinions and can set off this firestorm that can cost you your job and ruin your life and stuff like that. Like they seem to have a lot of power, but I don't think there's that many of them. I think there's 100 times, 1,000 times more people that see these problems, that have every right to be mad, some of whom are out protesting right now on both sides and have a lot of legitimate grievances. If we can find that common ground and understand each other and listen to one another, I don't think it would take a whole lot of horse trading to come up with ways that we could agree on making things better. And that would be investment in ourselves, on our planet, and on our children. And I think it can be done relatively easily if we can start that conversation. But starting that conversation is the most dangerous thing. Just to jump back to what you had said a while ago in the show, talking about how America changed in the 1670s, Bacon's Rebellion is what did it. Really it started that process when poor whites and poor blacks worked together and rebelled against the system where they were being exploited. And they found that solidarity, and that's what they tried to stop, and they've been trying to stop it ever since. So if we can find that spirit and listen to one another and not listen to the voices that want to divide us, I think we can turn things around. Call me an optimist. Part of me wakes up and I read the news and I look around and I just say, let America declare the purge to be real and let's slug it out and call it a day. But then, I think about my kids and I think about my neighbors' kids and things like that. And you remember, things can be better. It's not going to be like this forever. And we're the ones with the power because there's more of us. We can make these changes, but it's going to take understanding, compassion, and hard work. And I think it can be done, though. I do think we can have a brighter world. I do think good can triumph over evil. I do think love can triumph over hate. And, the worst type of hate is indifference. Indifference on if innocent people die and if they suffer, if they're rotting in a prison cell or they're in a bread line. I think things can be better. And I know that sounds stereotypical and sounds cheesy, but I honestly feel that, and I believe that the long march of history will result in a better world if we do our part. So hopefully listening, compassion, and hard work can start to turn things, because if not, it's going to get really bad, and then we're going to have to rebuild things anyway. We're just going to be in a worse spot, and the long march is going to be a lot longer. So let's shortcut the Civil War and the and all that stuff, and maybe just start fixing our country and deal with it, and then normal people can find ways to understand each other and work together and love one another. And you don't have to agree with someone on every blank social issue to work together for our shared interests. So that's what I'd like to see, and that's hopefully what we'll be able to do.
Well, very good. And I think that we should work toward winding up. And I think the way that we should wind up is we might return to the actual intention of our podcast, which I think we stayed on course largely with, although we deviated a little bit from the ideas, and we talked about the ideas in the context of the macro system in which they exist. But there's been a lot of commentary in the midst of these protests about this group. It wasn't a group, it was a meme, It was a joke, then it was a meme. It was a meme and a joke at the same time. Now it's a movement because a lot of people started to comment on it and show isolated posts about it, and of course people gravitated to it. But we've seen a lot of arrests and a lot of controversy around this group called the Boogaloo Boys, right? Boogaloo Boys, a meme that's based upon an old 80s movie that brought African American sort of culture into the white working class neighborhoods back in the 80s, called Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, and then they have all kinds of commentary on why they wear Hawaiian shirts. And essentially the idea is that the Boogaloo Boys is a code word for those that are anticipating an ability to see the fragmentation that we see unfolding in front of us manifest itself as a race war. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds a lot like the books and the ideas that we discussed in the Turner Diaries, and then talked about in our other episode, which covered Siege. And of course, certainly the idea inside of the far right in both of those entities is that the acts of the lone wolf terrorist or the lone wolf actor can in effect have reverberatory consequences that initiate such that the impending race war that will make that determination of what world we go on to live in, that from those ashes of that civil conflict will come the next civilization or the next society or the paradigm shift in, human evolution. And the real problem that we have in that is that it is largely based upon this similar idea. And so coming out of this thing, when we start to get back to the streets, and we're already seeing an increase in extremism in every way, shape, or form that we look at things, even before these protests, the rise of violent extremist activity, the rise of terrorism, largely now at this point from people that are just in a frenzy due to the uncertainty of COVID, the socioeconomic downturns, frustration that now has been going on for years, and we're probably going to see an exorbitant rise in violence once we start to work our way out of the COVID quarantine and we reopen our society, so to say, to conditions that, as you mentioned, economically are going to be very dire. And so getting back to the original intent and leading into the book that we'll cover next week, George Lincoln Rockwell's White Power, this idea of a race war in the context of mass movement that finds more, generally affluent liberals participating with African American Black Lives Matter protesters to address structural racism or systemic racism, but also really to have the concrete goal of defunding police, as I think absurd as it is that sounds. How far away are we from the day that we wake up and we realize that that race war that has seemed to be such a fanciful idea in the minds of nutballs like James Mason is something that we have to factor in as a potential probability in our country? Is that possible?
Oh yeah, I mean, you think about Yugoslavia, right? Like, everyone goes to bed one day, wakes up the next day, and like, all right, I guess it's game on. What caused the breakdown in Yugoslavia? The breakdown. Of course, obviously the loss of a long charismatic leader that bonded together a variety of ethnic groups with separate interests and things like that. And then of course we see the failed state, and then we got ethnic cleansing on multiple sides, and it's a bad time. I think like that's in the percentage higher than Yellowstone erupting. I do think it's there, and a lot of people have a lot of axes to grind. And in general, I think even deeper than just like race war as like something people even like want. It's more like this system is so wicked and oppressive and miserable for so many people that I think some, based on like reviewing some of like the Boogaloo Boys materials and stuff like that, they want to use a race war not because they want a race war, but because they want a disruption of the system to be able to tear this down and build something. Like who knows what comes out of the ashes, but something different has got to be better than this. But then of course there are people that legitimately just like want to fight out a race war, and that's Black Hebrew Israelites that hate white people. That's white supremacists that hate Black people. There's all. It takes all types, right? And I do think it is a problem. Here's where we're coming to the conclusion. I guess these are like my final thoughts. But yeah, it's a problem that exists, and we can either address these issues and try and find common ground and build larger and larger coalitions of people who generally aren't politically active, right? If people that don't vote, for instance, were to become their own political party, they would dominate all the branches of government, right? Because so many people just don't vote. So many people are just not involved. We got all these protests, and I'm sure some of these people are non-voters, but huge swaths of the American public just feel so disengaged. They don't participate in any meaningful way other than like going to work and surviving and just keeping their heads down. So if we can empower these people that have chosen to be voiceless because they've been made voiceless by the system, so they've just, they keep their heads down and try and avoid being attacked by the system or dealing with any other sorts of oppression and things like that. If we can empower everyone on this unity platform of a real rainbow coalition, I think that lowers our risk of civil conflict. But if we want to keep poking the bear and provoking each other and feeding into these politics of hatred, hatred against whites, reaction of people wanting to uphold monuments to white supremacy of the Confederacy and stuff like that. It just creates a endless cycle, and eventually it's just going to burst. And once it bursts, there's a lot of bad feelings, and there's been no truth and reconciliation committees to like bring people together or like find answers. There's just a lot of resentment, a lot of poverty, a lot of problems, a lot of society not living up to its obligations to the majority of the citizenry, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of people out there that have a lot of good reasons to want to go shoot something. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying I understand that goes across color lines, age lines, creed lines, all that. There's a lot of angry people out there with a lot of reasons to be angry. So let's short circuit that, hopefully, save lives, and build more meaningful existences together for all of us, right? So, but yeah, race war, definitely a chance, or at least like isolated racial conflict. And we're already seeing it on American streets. Everyone knows the names of the shooters who have done things like Dylan Roof. But then there are also things like, the knockout game that's been played, or even like in the county fair last year at my the one county over from where my hometown was. I was reading the newspaper that black youths just went up and killed a man right there in front of his family. Punched him in the head and he died, and it was racially motivated. But they were like that. That's part of like a racial conflict. Like that, those things happen. Like there's the shooter here in Tennessee who went into a majority white church and was specifically targeting white people to kill white people, right? Like, Brandon Tarrant shooting up a mosque. Like this stuff it's already happening. And unlike what the media narrative says, it's not just whites against people of color. It's going multiple directions. We've got gangland fights between black gangs and Latino gangs in Los Angeles and things like that. The largest gang bust in American history was the Hawaiian Gardens gang out there in LA, where Hispanics were ethnically cleansing a black neighborhood and things like that. So there's already a racial conflict. It already exists, and people are blind on purpose if they choose not to accept that. So we got to deal with the reality that a low-level racial conflict, not just white against non-white, but different ethnic communities against one another, as the friction and the economic stress, the political stress, environmental issue, when all these things are clashing together, that stress is going to boil out into outright aggression and, most importantly, I think, community self-defense, which then creates this escalation, right, between the different communities. So it's already happening. It's already here, and we can short-circuit it if we so choose, but it's going to take teamwork from everyone. And if not, then we're just going to live with the consequences, and it's not going to be pretty, and the innocent are going to pay, and that's not a reality I'm comfortable with accepting. So I'm doing my part. Hopefully everyone is. But Jesse, I'll leave that as my final thought and turn it back over to you.
I mean, I think that we didn't necessarily concentrate on a specific trajectory in conversation tonight. Essentially, what you're saying is you're adding a little bit of nuance to the problem, and you're suggesting that, again, what we might imagine as being a revolutionary moment of productive change may actually haphazardly be creating further divides, and because it's not attached to the underlying root issues that we really need to be worried about and addressing, it will probably only exacerbate the symptoms. And I myself try to stay an optimist, but find that a lot of what we're witnessing, I really can't fathom an immediate departure from this trajectory that seems to be pushing us off into an abyss. And it's remarkable how many people don't realize, how fragmented and how endangered, I think you might say, the system is. And it's remarkable as well how many people don't realize that we really don't have any ideas for what to do if that happens. And so anarchy tomorrow is a very real possibility, as is race war. And like you said, it could be in isolated pockets, but of course that has the potential to, get exponential increase in growth and mobilize sort of in the same way that the protest movements have. And I just find it utterly fascinating to watch. I'd like you to respond one more time to one more question, because one of the things that's really fascinating about the current manifestation of this is to watch those that are tasked with studying extremism take their definitions and not recognizing anything that's going on in the other aisle, the satisfactory fulfillment of some of the criteria of extremism with regard to hatred and justification of violence against an outgroup, your in-group bias, where the eligible in-group, if they don't agree with everything you say, is considered part of the outgroup. In fact, the apostates from the in-group being more hated, as you know from your life in extremism, than the outgroup itself, the in-group that doesn't agree with you, and all of this. And all of the variables that are associated with defining a violent extremist movement or to commenting on radicalization are not being applied across the board. And so really that's what we sort of formulated this podcast for, was to give a very different take on the primary ideas that drive the far right and that have driven the evolution of far right ideology. And some people mistake this for an opportunity to platform you as a former extremist and to express, your own de-radicalization. I think it's safe to say that you yourself don't consider yourself quote unquote de-radicalized, because it's a loaded term. But so that we can get back onto our episodes, can you just comment a little bit on what the overall purpose of you appearing on these podcasts with me and talking with me is, and how we think it might be able to contribute toward the cause that you and I are both engaged in? Can you talk about the mission? Can you talk about the objective of this as a stepping stone towards you playing a role to become part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem? And speak directly to that. Can you take us back on point, take us back on message? Next week, we're going to be talking about George Lincoln Rockwell's White Power. Can you take us back on message and remind us the mission, the purpose, your objective, and comment a little bit about the accusation that a lot of what we're saying by allowing, the accusations against us at Light Upon Light, at least, is that, by engaging you in open-ended dialogue here in this forum, we are essentially sustaining a platforming of far right, particularly by doing things like calling, George Lincoln Rockwell commander and other sort of criticisms.
People are big mad. I mean, the big purpose for me is I was pretty comfortable sitting on the sidelines, just going about my life after really removing myself from the movement. But seeing the uptick in arrests of folks from Atomwaffen and the base, and just in general, really made me be moved that while I'd had a political shift privately, in the comfort of my own apartment and things like that, that it really needed to be brought out there, because young men were throwing their lives away, and there was an increasing danger that innocent people could end up getting hurt. And there was really nothing that had developed to really answer that, of how can you create a system where you can legitimize people's legitimate grievances about what they're facing every day, and you're not dehumanizing them, right? While you don't necessarily have to agree with everything. And all that exists in the United States is we're going to arrest our way or kill our way out of the problem, or the people on the left, we're just going to dehumanize individuals we disagree with, that the only good fascist is a dead fascist, and the definition of a fascist is people praying the rosary outside of a Planned Parenthood clinic to a skinhead with a swastika on his forehead. Like, it's a messy situation where violence and the dehumanization of individuals is going not just one direction, and it's a big problem. So I wanted to be able to participate, to be able to try and find real solutions to problems by, one, working to get folks out of white nationalism into something I think that is, class-based, cross-racial movement. And I think that would be more effective to achieve the goals that most white nationalists, in my experience, want to have better lives for their kids. They want to feel heard. They want to have political representation that they don't feel that they have. They want to end the ongoing wars and conflicts of the American empire and things like that. And those are all legitimate, okay? And because I think a lot of people of different backgrounds have been ignored for so long, they have every reason to turn to radical politics, because the so-called acceptable state of any political system has been ignoring the people on the margins for a long, long time. So they have every reason to be radical. So why don't we create a new system that listens to the people and empowers them so they don't fall into extremism? We want to discuss these ideas. I mean, for me, I'm kind of unpacking my life in a certain extent, and the materials that influenced me, and then giving my perspective and hopefully educating people, because sometimes people don't have time to read 300 pages of an esoteric fascist book. But I already did it for you, so we'll save the time. And kind of on the last point, Jesse, that you brought up, I mean, things like, for instance, like calling George Lincoln Rockwell commander, like, first of all, that was his rank in the Navy, okay? And like, this is one of the problems that I see with, like, the left in general, is they're so hysterical on certain things, I mean, that you really can't discuss or debate truthfully. You've got to buy into the specific framework that they have created to be able to discuss facts, where it is either a statement of judgment, negative or positive, for George Lincoln Rockwell to refer to him by his proper rank that he got in the Navy, right? Like, he was a commander. And it's the same thing. If you try and draw distinctions between white nationalists and white supremacists, between separatists, between, all sorts of different ideas. And the real roots of what we're trying to get here is exploring the ideas in an accurate way. And there are certain people that do not want that to happen. They want to paint with a broad brush, and they want to deny rational, thoughtful conversation that is factually based, and of course, a conversation that is also informed by personal belief and experience. But I think that's far more grounded than really anything else that exists out there discussing these topics, because it's very convenient for them to be able to take the worst of every subculture or idea and just say, this is everyone, and we're just going to apply this in the most simplistic morality play possible. And it's really good for getting you to dehumanize people, but it's really bad when it comes to making public policy. So I care more about trying to affect and create policy that will impact people's everyday lives, hopefully for the better, versus creating and perpetuating hate and dehumanization of people who folks disagree with. So that's the main goal, and I think we're on the road and looking to really make 2020 into 2021 and beyond an exciting time to really do real world activism to help people in a real and meaningful, life-changing way, to make an impact on their lives and their communities, and hopefully achieve our goals of combating violent extremism in a way that actually solves systemic problems that lead to extremism. So,
yeah, very good. Thank you so much for sharing. And again, we look forward to next week's episode.
To use this motivation to help the largest amount of people and to make real systemic changes in our society for the betterment. So we're working on it, and our little podcast and all of our private work is and public work, and all the work we're doing is just one part of that. But we'll keep at it, and looking forward to next week.
Very good. Thank you, Matt, for concluding. And with that, another episode of Take a Walk on the Right Side with Jesse Morton, Matt Heimbach is concluded. We'll see you next week when we'll review Commander George Lincoln Rockwell's White Power. Thank you very much for being with us. See you next time.